When did you start working more with the Ramseys?
It might have been 94, that summer. Patsy Ramsey gave me the job, hired me.
Really?
One of the things I remember was she wanted pristine gardens.
Really?
Yeah, I was like, okay. Seemed like a pretty good job. I could use my own hours.
So how frequently did you see John?
Not very frequently at all. Once a season, maybe.
It might actually have been 95 that Brian Scott started working for the Ramseys the summer of 95. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, Brian Scott's interview with CBS's The Case of JonBenet Ramsey, the documentary that got slapped with a $750 million lawsuit and suppressed, well, it echoes the opening of Lawrence Schiller's book. Schiller's Perfect Murder, Perfect Town actually opens with Brian Scott with the gardener's account of the little girl and her asking him, do roses know their thorns can hurt?
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, I don't know about you, but this to me is a fascinating area, a very undiscovered country in terms of the Ramsey case. And there's something cruelly yet appropriately poetic about that statement from the 6-year-old. Do roses know their thorns can hurt? Given what apparently happened to her. But there's also something oddly familiar about the tone of that statement, in the same way that one's own garden is familiar to oneself in a very basic yet understated way. Think about how plants and gardens are analogous to little children. I mean, in the sense of budding and maturing, seasonal in the sense of going through phases, reaching out with stubby little fingers and toes to the outside world in search of space and sunlight, and growing into more elegant versions of themselves over time, developing language and skill and even mastery of their own forms and their surroundings, and also edging out other plants that are next to them, and eventually flowering in a graduated manner, slowly, but yes, in a sexual sense as well. And the way plants procreate, if you think about it, is subtle and silent compared to the quickened vivifications of animals and adults.
Did you ever run into the kids?
Yeah, not Burke so much, but JonBenet would come out and she would often, be playing relatively close to where I would be working.
If the Ramsey housekeeper gets the lion's share of attention in this case, besides the Ramseys themselves, and it makes sense that she does because Linda Hoffman-Pugh knew the insides of the Ramsey home and the family dynamics so well. Probably the best person to tell us about the outside of the Ramsey home and the broader comings and goings would be the gardener. Of course, the gardener, like the housekeeper, was also fingered by family members as a potential suspect. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, there's someone else in this documentary series that I also want to talk about that is very, very much overlooked, and that is Gretchen Smith. Have you ever heard of her? It's a policewoman from Boulder. Well, we'll be dealing with that in the next episode. For those of you who watched the previous episode who want to get your hands on a TCRS notebook, I'll put a link to those in the description. There's a 50-page notebook and a 120-page notebook. You guys can choose between those two. Notebook is really important to keep yourself informed on this case. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Did you know that the gardener, Brian Scott, was initially identified as a suspect by family members of the Ramseys? Let's go to JonBenet, Inside the Ramsey Murder Investigation, the book by Detective Steve Thomas. We're going to page 90. Nidra, that's Patsy's mother, Nidra gave us some 24 suspects off the top of her head. Just think about that. If someone committed a crime against you, would you immediately have 24 suspects off the top of your head to rattle off to police? It's pretty incredible. And then when we asked the initials SBTC, Nidra snapped, yes, son of a bitch, Tom Carson. Years before, Carson, the current chief financial officer at Access Graphics, had been involved in needless dismissal from the company. It would be interesting to know a little bit more about that, what that involved. In any event, she also pointed to Fleet and Priscilla White, Jeff Merrick and his quote-unquote vicious wife, the housekeeper, Linda Hoffman Pugh, a handyman, a painter, the gardener, that's Brian Scott, the nanny, and a couple of neighborhood kids. That's also quite interesting. And to make matters worse, Brian Scott didn't have an alibi. He went to the apartment of his girlfriend at 10:30 p.m. That's on Christmas night. But then he left Ann Preston's apartment at about midnight, the same sort of time window that JonBenet was thought to have died. Linda Arndt interviewed him twice, and he was also asked to give the police hair, blood, saliva, as well as samples of his handwriting. And he said when he had to do that, he realized, wow, they think I'm a suspect. Let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. The Ramseys gardener, Brian Scott, came up, this is as a suspect. Detective Arndt had interviewed him in February, but she was no longer working on the case. We really also do need to talk about Detective Arndt and what happened to her, and because she actually ultimately sued the authorities as well for defamation. Anyway, Ainsworth, I think that was her replacement, thought Scott's alibi should be rechecked and that he might be able to describe the condition of the grate covering the broken basement window. Now think about that. Who better to share his expertise, share his thoughts on this whole exterior to interior entry point? Harmer, that's Detective Harmer, she was the one who re-interviewed Scott. She showed him two photographs taken just after the murder. One was of a bushel basket with some weeds in it, and the other was of the window grate. To the police, the ground cover around the grate looked as if it had been disturbed, perhaps because the grate was lifted up. Looking at the photograph, Scott said it looked as if the ground cover had grown underneath the grate, which indicated that it had been lifted, but he couldn't tell when.
One of the biggest things that stands out was when I would be raking the leaves in the fall. I have all the leaves in a pile, and she wanted to jump in them. I remember her referencing it reminded her of time she spent with her dad. She seemed like a normal kid who just likes to play and misses her father. I remember that. I did remember seeing her practicing the violin.
Oh, really?
And Patsy was out talking to me, and then I think she went back and checked in and said, hey, you have to keep practicing.
Okay.
Don't put that down.
All right. And with respect to Burke, did he ever come out and play outside? Did you ever see him?
What I remember was he stuck to himself. He seemed a little more introverted. She was more engaging and more outgoing than him.
Now, I haven't played the full audio from the case of JonBenet Ramsey. What I seem to be noticing, and I could be wrong, but it seems to be that the interviewer is almost goading the subject, that's Brian Scott, into the area, about the pageants, about the way that JonBenet was perhaps sexualized. He doesn't say that word. And he says, well, I didn't really know anything about that. I didn't really see any of that. I just kind of saw the normal girl. And as far as I'm concerned, the interviewer was going into the wrong area. What I think he discloses, what the gardener discloses, is something about John Ramsey, that she doesn't see her father very often and that she missed him. And he doesn't really probe this area, which I think is actually quite important. Instead, he seems to be probing an area that perhaps, given the knowledge that Brian Scott was a former suspect, he's sort of trying to go into that area. But I mean, it is possible that I've misunderstood the interview. It's also interesting the way he sketches the dynamic between the two children being different, how their personalities are different. And we're going to deal with that when we deal with 5 insights from Brian Scott. Now, more broadly, if you were interested in the intruder theory, Brian Scott would be a logical suspect, someone who came from the outside, basically through the garden, right, into the inside of the Ramsey house. We've dealt at some length about the windows and the lighting. Well, who would be constantly exposed to the windows and be looking through the windows except the gardener? Remember, he had the run of the outside of the house more than probably anybody. But by the same token, if you wanted to prove or even disprove the intruder theory, the gardener would also be your man. For example, didn't Brian Scott know about the open, broken basement window? Did he? Did he or didn't he? What do you think? That's a question to write down in your notebook right now. Did Brian Scott know about the open, broken basement window? Write down your answer right there and let's see if it's correct. Now, this is information that is absolutely critical to the defense case. And here you have an invaluable witness, or perhaps even a suspect. It's one or the other. Which do you think it is? And that brings us to 5 insights from Brian Scott. Number 1, Scott noticed a broken window in the basement, but not the broken window. Now, you could argue that Brian Scott not noticing the broken window in the grate is carelessness from the gardener or even suspicious, except the gardener was aware of a broken window in the basement. And for those details, let's dip into Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Linda Arndt re-interviewed the Ramseys gardener Brian Scott. She had already spoken to him earlier in the month. Scott, who had graduated from the University of Colorado the year before, told the detective that he'd started working for the Ramseys in June 1995 as a landscaper. Now, either his memory is faulty, all of this time later, or this information in Schiller's book is incorrect. It's just interesting that there is a bit of a discrepancy there. The last time he was at the house was December 10th. That's also interesting. He was in the garden as late as 2 weeks before the incident, right? He was on the grounds in the middle of winter, so he would have experienced 2 winters in the Ramsey garden. Now, the family used large wooden candy canes to decorate the yard during the holidays. We've all seen them. And so Brian Scott was the person who put them there, right? And he noticed that they hadn't been arranged properly, and he went to some trouble to make sure that they could stand up, right, in the ground. They needed deeper holes, and he dug them before pounding them into the ground. Detective Arndt asked him what he remembered about the window well grate near the rear patio. To her credit, that was a very important question to ask. And so what did he say? What did he answer? Scott said he didn't remember that the window was broken. He didn't say, I didn't look down there. He didn't say, I didn't know what was going on down there. He said he didn't remember it was broken. He also said he'd only been in the basement to fix the sprinkler clock. He didn't know there was a wine cellar, much less where it was. This is also important. He did recall a broken window at the front of the house. That's also in the basement area, right? This is below Burke Ramsey's room. But it was for the electrical cord for the Christmas lights, and certainly not big enough for someone to crawl through, something like 2 inches square. Now, if you think about that, that's a broken window that was probably broken to allow the Christmas lights through. Now, I'm not sure if it would have been broken that Christmas or a previous Christmas. And that would certainly be a question that I would want to ask the gardener or perhaps ask the Ramseys. Now, if you think about that, isn't that broken basement window an analogy for another broken basement window? Isn't that perhaps where the idea came from? In any event, while Scott adjusted the candy canes along the front walk, he said that he saw a blue Chevy Suburban pull up to collect JonBenet. She was wearing a pair of blue overalls and was being bratty about something. Now, that comment also gives us a sense of the real JonBenet, that JonBenet could also be a handful. That was also something that the housekeeper also said. And so the gardener observes this and says, I think she might have been giving orders, Scott said. I don't know if that means JonBenet was, but it seems like it, meaning JonBenet was giving someone orders, saying something like, you get in the back, you do this, something like that. Now, perhaps she was giving orders to another child in the car. Perhaps she was giving orders to her brother, who knows. A moment later, the car was gone, and he said that was the last time he saw JonBenet. Now, this is a rare glimpse into the spirit of JonBenet, a little child that did have her own sense of identity, that did stand up for herself. And you can imagine within the context of this crime, whatever it was, she also stood up for herself in some way. She resisted what was happening to her. When she felt pain, she objected to it, and did so with a piercing, blood-curdling scream. This little anecdote from the gardener gives JonBenet a little bit of a voice in her own story, doesn't it? Now, can I share my opinion on Brian Scott? Because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of you saying, oh, I think he did it. I believe Brian Scott is an important witness, not a suspect. For starters, none of his samples were a match, not his DNA, not his hair, or his handwriting. And if he really wanted to take JonBenet, why do so with a house full of people when he knew that John was away half the time? Also, why would he go straight from his girlfriend to the Ramsey home? And then another reason I believe Brian Scott is it reinforces the same thing the housekeeper said. She never noticed the broken window in the basement either, nor did she clean up any glass. So think about it. On this important first point, if we accept Brian Scott and Linda Hoffman-Pugh's statements, then the basement window possibly wasn't broken prior to December 1996. Now we're going to run through the other 4 insights relatively quickly. Number 2, leaves in winter. Going back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, that evening, he said, I left a big pile of leaves out front by the gutter for her to play with. That's also an area below Burke Ramsey's room. That was probably the last time I spoke to JonBenet. 6 weeks later, I took the morning paper from my front steps and saw it, the news of this incident. And so what this reveals is 6 weeks earlier, he left a big pile of leaves for JonBenet to play with. Brian Scott was at the Ramsey home as recently as 10 days before the incident. And so in this period when he wasn't there, wouldn't there have been a buildup of leaves during that period? I mean, after he raked up a huge pile of leaves. And if JonBenet played in this last pile of leaves he raked up, surely that leaf debris would be on the lawn, some of it, and ought to have been picked up perhaps on the wet shoes of the intruder and carried into the home. Did that happen? Number 3, snow in the walkways. Who would be a better person to describe their observations regarding the nuances of snow and frost on grass and walkways in Boulder than the Ramsey's own gardener, and on this particular property in particular? Number 4, Burke as an introvert. Perhaps some of the best insights we get from the gardener, and quite surprisingly, are regarding the family dynamics. Burke, he's described as a loner and an introvert. Did he become that way, or was he that way all along? Because he doesn't seem so introverted when we see him running around the church. Is he that introverted when he speaks to Detective Dan Schiller, or Dr. Suzanne Bernard, or Dr. Phil? I mean, that's quite an interesting question in and of itself. Is Burke an introvert? Number 5, absent father. Now, this part came up in this interview with CBS. It also came up in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, where he says, last year my dad and I did that, meaning my dad raked up the leaves and I jumped in them. And that's the part that I think the FBI profiler misses here, where the reference to the leaves, the gardener thinks quite interesting, quite funny, but the profiler misses the fact that JonBenet had such a good time with her father that she asks the gardener to recreate that. And then not only that, but says, I miss him, I miss my father, and she actually starts crying. So this was a significant factor in JonBenet's little life, that she didn't see her father very often. And the gardener didn't see him very much either, didn't see John Ramsey very much either, said that he saw him once a season. And the gardener even quizzed JonBenet about this. JonBenet said, I really miss him, meaning John. I wish John, my dad, was around more. And then he said, where does he go? And the JonBenet said, I don't know. And obviously the answer was that he would go on business trips. And I seem to remember a housekeeper saying that John was around about once a week. And remember, he was trying to create a $1 billion company that requires effort and investment and time away from home. But JonBenet did say this. Sometimes he goes away for a long time. And then the gardener said, you really miss him? And then she said, yeah, I really miss him a lot. Then she started to cry, tears rolling down her cheek. So that wasn't just a throwaway statement. This was a big deal to this little girl. And that brings up this idea of neglect. How often was John away? Did he know what was going on with JonBenet? Should he have known? Should he have known that certain things were going on with her? And I also think it rubs out this whole idea of John being some kind of perpetrator. Well, he was never home to be a perpetrator. That even goes for Christmas Day, where John disappeared for 2 or 3 hours by his own admission on Christmas Day, even when he was supposed to be home. Even when he was technically home, he left the home for several hours. And although he says he went to the airport to put things into the airplane, ostensibly the Ramseys packed and some of that went into the airplane, I can't help wondering whether John was tempted to go to work and do some work on that particular day.
One of the things I remember was when they announced that O.J. Burke.
We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty of the crime of murder.
I was at their house.
You were outside working on the bar.
Kathy came out and told me that O.J. was declared innocent.
Good. But does he quit? He must have quit.
I just remember that she came out and started talking about it. Yeah, she thought O.J. got it. She didn't like that one bit. She did say, you can get away with murder in this country.
That anecdote is also in Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. I can't help thinking Jim Clemente read that book and wanted to get these sort of snippets on video, on camera, in terms of, what he'd already said in that book. But think about it. A year after O.J. got away with murder, someone else would get away with killing JonBenet. And 28 years later, they still are. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.